Okay, so I'll be using this scene right here. I could use spheres, but I think this would be maybe a little bit more visually interesting to see how this is going to respond to light. So I am going to create a plane. Oh, not like that. Create a plane. So it has something to sit on. So the first thing I'm going to do, also create a sphere, and maybe this will make sense in a second. I'll create two spheres so we can check it out. And I will edit, delete all by type history, file, save scene as, a new scene. I don't want to save it as an MB, so I'll save it as 06A. And I will save it out and continue. I'll do one more thing and then I'll save it out. So if I go to my Hypershade, I'll click on the Arnold tab on the left right here, and I'm going to be using my AI standard material. Whenever you're rendering an Arnold, you should always be using this AI standard. There are other materials that can be used, but it's better to just start off with a default AI standard.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So are we doing this in Arnold then?
Yeah.
Oh,
okay. It'll just be easier to go over lighting and rendering in Arnold than to try and get everything into the Unreal Engine, especially since everyone is at different parts. Like, no one has entered into texturing. Some people have started UVing. Some people are trying to finish up modeling.
Yeah. So
I want to give you guys this extra week, or this last week, to finish out your projects, to get a good portfolio piece, or to just get a good project out of it, instead of trying to rush to get things done and then rush to try and get into a video game engine.
Yeah.
I want you working on this on your own time. So I have a AI standard, and if I go to my material viewer up here, by default it's set to hardware. If I click on this little arrow, I can switch it over to Arnold. And it's a pretty good representation of how the material will look in Arnold, but I don't necessarily use this as my standard as to exactly how the material will look. I am more concerned with how it looks on my objects and how it will render. So I will start off by adjusting my color. So I'll bring it down to a 50% gray. I'll bring the weight up to 1. And I'll leave my specular weight down to 0. I'm going to create one more AI standard. For this AI standard, I'm going to bring my weight down to 0, but I'm going to bring my specular weight all the way to 1. And I'll bring my roughness down to 0. And I'll go into explaining the mentality of these weights and colors and how they work.
Wait, specular to 1 and then what?
The diffuse weight is at 0, and the specular weight is at 1.
Yeah.
And once I start rendering, I'll go over a little bit more detail as to what's going on. But I'll select all my geometry, excluding the sphere, and I'll apply my first AI standard to the geometry. So if I hold, you have to hold right click in this little gray area right here, which will bring up this option, this hot menu, and you want to go to assign material to viewport selection. I'll select the other sphere, and I'll apply my second AI standard material to it. So I have 1 on this sphere and I have 1 on this sphere. So I will close out my Hypershade for right now. I'll do one more save. So now I have this default scene that I can show 2 lighting examples with. So the very easiest lighting example that can be done. If I click on this tab up here, there is, you guys should be familiar with the area light.
Mhm.
By just putting an individual area light in there and having it light up. The create dome light is something that I'll be going over next, but it can create light that is coming from every point. But for this first example, I'm going to create a physical sky. So I will click it once.
Which one? The dome light?
I clicked on create physical sky.
Oh.
So this is an older Maya, so let's see what happens when we render. As you can tell, it's beautiful.
It's a beautiful silhouette.
So why is it black?
So if it's physical sky, it'll bring some lighting in.
It should, but as you can tell, it's not working at all.
Are you supposed to increase intensity or just?
No, it's not that. Because the sky in the background looks fine, but everything else is black.
Sounds reliable.
When I was messing with the physical sky before, I had to still apply like the I had to do the AI sky to get any light. The physical sky actually just was like a texture almost.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it didn't actually provide any light whatsoever.
So newer versions, I guess, do it for you. So, so this is a visual physical sky. So if I go to my render options up here, I can go to Arnold Render tab, and I can go to Environment. But see, it's putting AI physical sky in my background here, isn't it? All right, it's time to be smarter than Maya. This is how we're going to do it. Since the physical sky doesn't seem to be working, and it works in newer versions of Maya, and we're not here to diagnose, I'm here to teach, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to open up the original scene that I had saved with my material, and I'm going to create my own physical sun and sky. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my dome light. And I can scale this up to be, oh, maybe I can't scale it up. All right.
Yeah, that works in infinite directions, so it doesn't change size.
It does work in infinite directions, but as a visual thing, I would like to scale it up so it's not intersecting my house.
Yeah, it was intersecting my stuff at first too, but once I applied the texture, there wasn't an issue.
Oh, the HDRI texture?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I was going to use it as a just a regular light.
Yeah, change it to sky radius.
You're already on it, the channel.
Yeah.
This one?
Yeah. You click off it and then apply.
All right.
That is
Select sky radius,
No,
put
no,
it
no,
at
no.
some absurd value, 5,000, click off of it, and you're beautiful.
You should have used 9,000.
Oh, brother. All right, so I have this sky dome out here. If I render it, I should see something more than what I was seeing before. But sky isn't necessarily white, so I'm going to change it to a blue.
Yeah, you should tell them to update it to 2018.
So I'll make it a extreme blue at first. So I've created a dome light, which will create my ambient light or from the blue sky, and it'll show up here. So I'm going to close my render for right now. I'll then go hit spacebar, and I'll create a light in here. These lights in here are specific to Maya. Some of these lights Arnold can work with. One of them is this directional light. This directional light imitates the sun, or light that is infinitely coming from one direction. So I'll bring in the directional light.
What if you want the moon?
What? The moon?
Yeah.
I'm not teaching that lighting either.
Darn.
So our sun has a little bit of a yellow tinge to it. So I'll change my color to be slightly yellow. If I click on this tab right here, I can go to its Arnold properties. And
How do you access the Arnold properties?
so by clicking on the light,
Mhm.
there are these arrows right here. I'm in my attribute editor, and there's this arrow right here next to Arnold. And these attributes allow you to affect it for Arnold. But let's render it out just to see what it's looking like. So my blue sky is maybe a little on the bright side. I don't want my cast shadows to be this bright, so I can select my light in the back and I can adjust the intensity to something lower.
Which light is it?
This is my dome light in the back. So if I adjust the intensity, then I can get darker shadows. If I adjust the color to be a little bit more saturated, then I can get bluer shadows. I can then click on my directional light and I can adjust its intensity to say, let's say 2. And right now the yellow is probably a little extreme, so I'll tone it back down to a white because I don't want it to be, like our sun doesn't look that yellow. But I want the yellow to kind of fight with the blue a little bit. So I get those warms and those cools. So I'd say it's looking pretty good for, that literally took me 5 minutes to set up. And it gives the illusion of it being outside. So if I go to, if I look at my cast shadow right here, you'll notice that my cast shadow is crisp. The cast shadow is being controlled by the directional light. So if I go to angle right here, and I change it to maybe 5, then I can start to get a blurred shadow as it gets farther away from the building. Our shadows don't get this blurred in real life, so let's do an angle of 1 and see how it looks. It's looking pretty. Huh?
It's Mickey Mouse.
Okay, I'll look somewhere else. I don't want Disney to find me.
It's a bad Mickey Mouse.
So if I adjust the samples, let's do something extreme to see it. So it's going to take a lot. It might be oversampling too much. Oh no, it's just an incredibly high value. So I increase my value, so I'm getting really nice blurred shadows. But as a result, my render times have drastically increased. So for my samples, I'm going to leave it at 1 for now.
What is this one under? Directional light?
This is the directional light. So the directional light is creating this cast shadow. So this stippling, this kind of little ants that are happening right here, is due to the low samples of the light. So if I look at my doorway, you can also see the ant kind of speckling that's happening in here. But as opposed to my cast shadow, this type of lighting is actually being controlled by my dome light. So I don't want to sit here and render this whole entire thing forever. So I can click on this button right here, which is crop region. And by clicking it once and then dragging across an area, I can then focus my render time or my CPU cycles on that given area as opposed to my entire scene. So I will click on my dome light without moving my camera. Yeah, what's it?
What was that called?
In the Arnold render view, there's this little button right here that says crop region. And if you click that and drag across all your CPU rendering cycles will happen in here as opposed to the entire thing.
Good.
So this speckling in here is actually being caused by the dome light. So without moving my camera, if I click on my dome light, I also have samples right here. So I'll increase it to 3. So you can see the difference between the speckling that is happening here versus how smooth it is here.
Mhm.
So I think 3 is a pretty good number. You guys see that, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. I think 3 is a pretty good number. So if you turned in your house with this lighting, that's perfectly fine. Literally, that took me, I mean, I'm explaining it, but it should be incredibly simple to get
Mhm.
physical sun and sky, a physical sun and sky look
Yeah.
with your model.
Yeah.
Jose?
Yeah. Why do you have those two spheres there?
So
So no.
the reason I have the spheres here is because if I didn't have the house here, usually I start off with spheres. And the spheres illustrate 2 things. One, I can see what my key light intensity is looking like. I can see what my core shadow is looking like, and I can see what my bounce light is looking like. The reason I brought a reflection in here is because the dome light that I placed in here is only using a single color. So this setup might be pretty boring if you modeled the car, because the car is reflecting its environment, and if it's just reflecting blue, then it's visually could be more interesting than what is being shown. But since our houses are just using a simple texture and not necessarily complex materials that are reflecting, this kind of light setup is perfectly fine for the house. So I like to have 2 spheres in my scene that describe the lighting form versus the reflection form. You can actually see the little sun. Actually, I think I can see it if I rotate my... Oh, no, I can't see it. You can see it in the reflection. You can see the little sun
Oh yeah.
that is from the directional light.
Should we do a background or it will be just like that?
So it's okay if you turn this in with a black background.
Thanks.
If you did want to add a background, if you save this out, then it could be added in Photoshop. That's probably the easiest way. Just put a color gradient. So I wait for this to finish rendering. But before it's done with that, by default it's at 960 by 540. So I'm doing tests, so I would wait till the very end to change. Let me first go into my render settings and scroll down. Once I'm happy with my lighting and my texturing and everything, then I would change my resolution to something higher res, something like 1920 by 1080. So one thing that I want you guys to be aware of is, let me bring my camera down here. There are 2 ways to make your renders look good. There is one way is by the light source, and let's say the other way is by the, well, I guess there's 3 ways to make it look good, but let's say there's 3 ways to make it look good. There's through the lights, there's through the material, and then there's through the actual render. So speaking specifically about the lights and the render, the lights had an initial sample of 1, and I changed that to 2 or 3. But if I go into my Arnold render tab right here, you'll notice that you actually have more sample information that governs the whole entire scene. So we don't necessarily need to go into the nitty-gritty of some of this stuff. The two biggest ones are camera anti-aliasing and ray depth diffuse. So if I change my camera anti-aliasing to 4, let me do a render region to show you guys. If I change it to say 6, can you guys see the difference? See how this is a cleaner calculation than this? So I can increase my anti-aliasing here, but it increases across the whole entire render. I can adjust my sampling on a light or on a material, but it's specific to that light and to that material. If you increase your samples for your light really high, but something else in your scene doesn't look good and you need to adjust the camera anti-aliasing, now this 6 is going to be multiplied by that extremely large sample number that you either applied to your light or to your material. So the best way to work it out is to keep your samples low on your lighting and your materials. Increase your camera anti-aliasing a little bit, and if you do need that extra rendering cleanliness, then go to the individual light and increase it by an increment of 1 or 2. Don't put crazy numbers, or else your computer could be sitting there rendering for a really long time and you won't even necessarily see the difference between a high number and a medium high number. So camera anti-aliasing controls the entire frame. If I go to ray depth diffuse and I switch it to 0, no, maybe not. 1, maybe it's not ray depth diffuse. Is it diffuse? No. Hang on, let me get another angle. It's really hard to see. So diffuse sampling is the, I'm pretty sure it's the one. Diffuse. No, it is ray depth. Let me find a good example. So let me look at this corner up here. So it's really spotty because my my resolution, my sampling is just, oh, it's actually taking a long time to render. So I don't want to sit here and render forever. So I'm going to crop the region to this corner. So I'll change ray depth to 0. See how it went black? The other areas weren't as apparent, but my diffuse being at 0 means that my light is no longer bouncing around. It's no longer behaving like a normal light. It's no longer creating the indirect lights. The reason that we can see this dark room the way we see it is because the lighting in the back is not only shooting down and out, but it's getting either absorbed in colors and materials, or it's reflecting and bouncing around this room to illuminate this room. I don't have any lights that are creating direct light that is presented here, so the area becomes completely black. If I change my diffuse to 1, it starts to light up, but overall it's still black, because what's happening is that the light ray is being shot from the light source, hitting an object, reflecting off that object, hitting another object, and stopping. If I change my diffuse to 2, it gets a little bit brighter, which means that my ray is being shot from my light, which is bouncing off an object, hitting another object, bouncing off the object, hitting another object, and stopping. If I increase my diffuse to 1,000, then that ray is going to bounce 1,000 times. light rays bounce off a lot, but I found that diffuse at anywhere from 2 to 4 creates a pretty good example. So again, I'll decrease my diffuse to 0. I will adjust my camera so we can see it better.
Oh, whoa, that looks cool looking.
That is a very good point that you just brought up. Nighttime. The reason we can see things at night is because the direct light from the sun is striking our moon, and our world is being illuminated by indirect light. So the amount of energy that we see being transmitted from the moon is far less than what is coming from the sun. A little light bulb that is sitting above a door, it doesn't have the same energy as the sun, so it's not going to be able to have the same power and be able to bounce around enough to illuminate the area. So if I wanted more night scene, then I could adjust my diffuse to be lower, or I could adjust the lighting so it doesn't bounce as much. But if you're up in space, this diffuse should be 0 because there's nothing the light can bounce off of to create indirect light. But for the most part, in our world, say like 2 to 4 is probably a good amount.
That looks cool at 0.
See how visually different it is
Yeah.
when you have the indirect light. This is what gives Arnold the power that it has, is its indirect lighting calculations. A lot of renderers are going more this physically accurate route to be able to get materials to look great, to be able to get lighting to look great.
Is that PBR?
That is material specific. So PBR is physically based. Well, okay, PBR is physically based rendering, but it's usually associated with material. So how a material responds to light, whether it be absorption, refraction, reflection, will be physically accurate. And then the other part of the equation is direct light and indirect light, and being able to get light to not only illuminate but to bounce around an area to give the illusion of it being lit up. In the movie Up, in the movie, I mean, yeah, you look at any of these posters and anything from like 2012, 2010 and below, a lighting artist would come into the scene and literally put 1,000 lights into the scene to give the illusion of direct light and indirect lighting.
Huh.
Now that we have this power, I can put 2 lights in my scene for what people put thousands of lights in their scene to be able to create a shot. Are there any questions on this light setup?
Is it possible to exclude objects from certain lights, like you would in like my software?
Yeah, so we have 30 more minutes. We can do it. Okay, so this is pretty hard because my geometry isn't named. This is vital information, but it's not exactly relevant to what we're doing. So I'm going to name this geometry something geo light. If I go to rendering, and if I go to, let's see, where'd they move it? There we go. Lighting and shading, light link editor, light centric. I get all my lights in my scene to the left, and I get all my geometries, and my scene is very dirty, but I get all my geometries off to the right. So if I click on my dome light, this dome light is blue and all this geometry is blue, which means that this light is influencing all this geometry. If I left click on something geo light, Then let's try direct light. Let's stop this. Let's stop this and then bring up the render view again. Clap for me, clap for me. Okay, I don't know how to do it. Sorry. They must have a new way to do it. So, yeah, I don't know how to do it. This is how you're supposed to be able to do it. So I'll look into it and get back to you. But this is how it's always been done. So obviously Arnold is doing something different because this piece of geometry should go completely black.
I knew of the relationship editor, and then I was talking to Chris, who was like the other lab assistant, and he was part of this stuff.
Is that what he showed?
Yeah, and it didn't work.
Yeah. So you should have stopped me and made myself look like a fool. Yeah, I don't know how. The thing with Arnold is that it just recently got integrated into Maya, so I'm learning it, but I'm sure there's probably something in here. Arnold, trace sets, per frame, subdivision, displacement, volume. Yeah, can't easily figure it out. Anyway, that's how you get it feeling like it's outside. So I'm happy with this. So I'm gonna save this scene out to daylight. I'll save it. Then I'll continue. Now, if you're modeling the car, or if you don't want to do this daylight setup because daylight tends to be a little on not necessarily the bland side, but it's pretty straightforward. You have a sun and you have blue sky, and it creates two distinct color patterns on your geometry. It's mainly the interesting aspects of your piece are being driven by texture as opposed to lighting. But if you want something more visually interesting, you could use what I'm going to show right now, which is high dynamic range image lighting. So I'm going to open up my previous scene. So I'm back to my original material, and I'm back to my reflection material. I'm going to go to the World Wide Web, and I'm going to do a Google search for image or IBL GUI. I forget the website by heart, but I remember how to search for it. So this is image-based lighting GUI, and I'll hit enter. At the very top, it's hdrlabs.com.
Wait, did you show us this one?
Yeah, I'm just recording it and going over it again. So this website it used to have a really good GUI that I would use a lot. I don't know the last time it was updated, but it's free if you want to check it out. But what's really great about this site is that I can go to this SIBL archive, and SIBL stands for Smart Image-Based Lighting. I won't go into details. I'll just say it's smart image-based lighting. And all of these environments are at our disposal. You can use them to represent your work. You can use them in your portfolio. You just can't use them to sell or to basically you can't sell them or create something and sell it. So just use it as a learning device. A lot of these, you can experiment with a lot of these. Some of them don't work too well. I know this red one is just a little bit too intense. These lights don't work unless you have his GUI system. As you get farther down, these are other creations of image-based lighting. Rhode Island School of Design has some really good ones. HDR source, and then these are specific to the GUI too. So I would stick primarily up at the top right here. So depending on what you want it to look like. So I am going to do Bryant Park. Depending on the lighting, you could either get strong cast shadows or you could get very diffuse cast shadows. So let's try Bryant Park and just see what it looks like. Download the zip, show in folder, open up my zip. It'll come with multiple images, and the one that we want to zone in on is the largest .hdr file. In this one, there are two .hdr files. One is 7.1 megabytes. One is 135 kilobytes. The reason there are two, I'll just say it really quick. The reason there are two is because the higher the resolution of your .hdr, the essentially more light rays are in your scene that it's calculating. If you're not necessarily worried about clarity and resolution, you can use the lower resolution one, and you'll get generally the same result, but I don't like to cut corners, and I like my stuff to look as good as it can, so I go for the highest .hdr file. So I'll copy that. I'll go to my project, and I'll go to my source images, and I'll place my .hdr, my Bryant Park HDR, into my source images folder. I'll go back to Maya. There are two areas that this HDR has to live. The first one is under the display render settings. I'll go to my Arnold render tab, and I will go to environment, and I will click on the checkered box for background, and I'm going to create sky shader. Under color for the checkered, I'm going to go to file, and then click on the yellow folder that pops up on the right here. And I'll do a search for my Bryant Park 2K.HDR. I'll open it up. I'll close this, and then I will create a skydome light. With the skydome light under color, I'll go to the checkered box, go to file. I'll attach that same .hdr using the yellow folder. Bryant Park 2K, open it. And I'm not going to scale up this sphere. I'm just going to render it out and see what happens. Hit render view. It will process the .hdr into a .tx file. Whoa, it's blown out! Okay, so this is another old version of Maya. Let me think. But I don't want it to be that low. Alright, fine. Stop. It's calculating both at the same time. So let me go to my outliner and delete my skydome light. Let me render it. Looks a little better.
I give it.
What? Really? Okay, it doesn't look that much better. Okay, I can't cut this out of the video. Sorry. Start over. Old Maya is a little different than what I was working with. Alright, back to new scene. Create sky dome. Create checkered. File. Yellow folder. Bryant.hdr. Render. Process. God, it's so bright. That's a bummer because it renders differently on my machine. Did you have this problem, Aaron?
Honestly, I think this is a little different than how I originally did it.
What if you just increase the size of the thing?
Actually, I had a question for you on this one. The file I'm using came with an HDR file and an 8K file. And it seems like the 8K one works better. It doesn't seem to give me any issues.
This one is a 4K. Let me try the other one. Let me stop it.
Actually, it looks like
I mean, this isn't a good example, but sometimes when you bring in an HDR, it is dependent on how it was created, and there's a potentiality of it being created incorrectly. Like, it looks so... the two HDRs look so different. See, this looks a little more correct, and the other HDR was completely blown out.
Yeah, for mine I had to put my emission to 0.5, otherwise it would just make the whole scene start to glow.
So play around with the HDRs. Like this HDR looks fine. The other HDR was blowing it out pretty immensely. So let me recap, since there was probably some confusion. I apologize because it is dependent on how the HDR is made, and it is dependent on what version of 2017 you have, and it's dependent on if it's 2018. So I'll bring up my building_geo_06.a. I won't save. This is using my AI standard material. This is using my reflection material. I'll bring in my skydome light. I'll adjust my sky radius to something large. 5,000, click off of it. I'll go to my attribute editor. I'll go to my color, my checkered box, and I'll go to file. Image name, using the yellow folder. And instead of using Bryant, because something may be happening with it, I'm going to use the Ditch River 2K .htr. When I hit render view, the lighting is coming from behind it, and I can either rotate my model or I can click on my dome and I can rotate it. Oh. I can rotate it. Oh, did I kill it? No, I didn't. So I rotate the dome light. And it's looking a little dark at the moment. So one thing that I can do is by selecting my camera And under my attribute editor, I can go to the Arnold tab right here and click the arrow to pull it down. And I can adjust my exposure a little bit, so I can be a little bit brighter. It's looking pretty good. The nice thing about HDRs is that if I come to my reflected material, I can adjust my material. So if I select my material, I can go to my specular weight, and I can adjust my roughness so that it's not as crisp of a reflection. You can also turn on Fresnel, and I can turn, it's pretty good. So I can get, with Fresnel, what Fresnel is that you can imagine like a clear coat on this piece of geometry. The individual bits that make up the clear coat start to appear to line up with each other. So it creates a glancing angle. So it can make this appear to be more reflective as it comes to the edges as opposed to looking directly at it. Depending on the material, you can adjust the direct specular independently from the indirect specular. So be conscientious of, you know, like you might be able to see this in a train or in a building, or you might be able to see the reflection happening because of the lighting outside, but it may not necessarily be reflecting the indirect light as strongly. Let me shut the door really quick. Oh, it's really dark. Looks a lot better on my screen. It looks a lot better in the YouTube video. But so my weight is at 1. Roughness is at some odd number. So I can get, so with an HDR, I can get some really nice reflections on here. So this is the time when I want to talk about color and weight. So I have a little bit of time. So to think about, the best way to think about it is if I go to Photoshop, and let's say you have color, color and specularity. The best way to think about it is that they are on a scale. Look at my beautiful drawing of a scale. Okay.
Ooh, yummy.
So if my color weight decreases like this, then my spec should, doesn't necessarily should increase, but the two are connected to each other. So if I want something really reflective, then my color weight needs to be reduced. What the heck? Come on. It needs to be reduced. Because if you can imagine that I have a sphere. I have a sphere that looks like this, and I have a light ray that is coming down and striking this sphere. If this light ray is at 1.0. The reason we see this red is because of the visual spectrum. So everything is being reflected except for red, because red is getting absorbed. So that means that some of this 1.0 light is being reflected to create this red. Now, if it has some specularity to it, it's a horrible specularity, but some of this lighting information, this 1.0 strength, is not only being absorbed and reflected by the red, now it's really being reflected by the specularity. Okay, so if I come back to my diffuse weight, so I'll turn off my Fresnel so that the reflection is a lot easier to see. I'll bring my specular weight down to 0. I'll bring my color to 50, and I'll bring my weight to 100%. If my weight is at a 1.0 and I increase my specular weight to 1.0, now my material is saying that the return value that I'm getting from here is essentially double the strength of the light coming in here. So you start to get really blown out lights, or you get a non-physically accurate value. So the best way to create, say, a light object is to I'll bring down the specular weight. I'll bring up my color to a white. I'll notice that the weight needs to be dropped down because my specular weight needs to be increased. And I'm still getting that hot spot, but it's nowhere near as intense as it once was. So if I want to create a mirror, I can bring my weight all the way down to 0, because when you look at a mirror, you don't necessarily see color. And then I can increase my specular weight to 1, because it's 100% reflecting the environment. So artistically, we have control over both these examples. In the real world, they are very closely tied together. So if I wanted to create a plasticky material, I could change my color to a, say, orange. And I'll lower my specular weight, and I'll increase my diffuse weight. And then I will adjust my roughness so it's not a perfect reflection. And then I can turn on Fresnel to only get it around the edges, to emphasize the edges.
So what about wood?
What about wood? Wood is going to be, you're going to have a relatively high diffuse weight. The color is going to be a bit of a dark brownish, maybe not too saturated, but the specular weight is going to be low, but the roughness is going to be very high.
Oh.
I mean, it looks more like mud, but adjust the color a little bit. I'll adjust the roughness so it's not too blurry.
Huh.
So if I had just a really nice texture here with maybe a bump map,
Mhm.
then that can start to look a bit like wood.
Oh, okay.
Now, if it's clear-coated wood on the ground and it's really reflective, then our specular weight would be increased, our roughness would be decreased, and our weight of our color would be decreased. Those are the main attributes that you'll be messing around with this shader. There is this option called reflection, but if I turn off the weighting for specularity and I turn on the weight for reflection, all it does is 100% reflect the geometry or the direct light in your world. So the documentation that I've read online talks about, oh, it's great because you can just instantly get a mirror. It's like, okay, well, that's cool, but if I turn my reflection weight down to 0 and I turn my specular weight up to 1 and I change my roughness to 0 and I can change my color weight down to something really low, I can get a pretty good looking mirror. I guess I could use the reflection to kind of boost up the brights a little bit, but I wouldn't use it independently. I wouldn't use it by itself. I can also turn on Fresnel on here too to get that really nice reflection. So I would use reflection in conjunction with specular, but some documentation says use it independently. We have 2 minutes to create a mirror or glass. Waited to the very end. There's subsurface scattering, but I haven't been able to get it to work correctly. It doesn't work how it's supposed to actually work. It just tints the whole thing one color.
How do you do
But let's skip that for right now. So I'll close my render window for right now. I'll click on my geometry, and I'll go to my attribute editor. Under Arnold, I need to turn off opaque. And I will render view. I will then make that black too. Wait. So I have high specularity. I'm going to decrease my specularity so we can kind of see through it. I'm going to decrease my reflection so we can see through it. And I'm going to go to refraction, and I'm going to change my weight to 1. And this IOR stands for index of refraction. If you do a Google search for index of refraction numbers, there's a whole plethora of values that can be put in. Essentially, air is 1. It's pretty far of a decimal place to change it to there. But if I go to glass is at 1.65. So if I change my index of refraction to 1.65 and hit enter, the thickness of your geometry matters because now it's refracting the light as if it was literally that thick. This is an artistic program, so let's say you made your glass a little bit too thick. So I would adjust your index of refraction just enough to where it's looks good. But if this were made like a thin sheet of glass, then this index of refraction would be fine at 1.65. I can move the camera around. Actually, you know what? Let's do this. Refractions are computationally expensive, as you can tell.
Yeah.
It is 9:31. This might be it. Are there any remaining questions?
So do we come on Tuesday and Wednesday
Do you come on Tuesday and Wednesday?
to class?
Mhm.
Or we just okay.
So Tuesday for the other class, normal time. Wednesday for this class, normal time. There will be no critique.
But we will take a look at each
But-
other's work. Right?
Yeah, but we're gonna look at everyone's work. It's your day, and we're just going to enjoy all the work everyone has done. I'm gonna stop this. So yeah, experiment with both lighting examples. Obviously, the HDR can have some issues depending on what HDR you pick and how it's set up, but experiment, and if anything, just go back to the kind of physical sun and sky that we had created.